Officer of the Canadian Bioethics Society, the Société canadienne de bioéthique. I am pleased to be with you all today and to host this session on justice issues in global health ethics, which is part of our ongoing conversation series led by the Canadian Bioethics Society and generously sponsored by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Today's conversation will be moderated by Dr. Daryl Pullman of Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, and will feature presentations by Dr. Ryoa Chung of the Université de Montréal and Dr. Maxwell Smith of Western University, to whom you will be introduced very shortly. I'm delighted that we have a number of our CBS-SCB members of our board, and representatives of our supporting organizations with us here today. And welcome to all of those of you who are not yet members, but who are here out of interest for today's topic. We hope that you will consider joining us, not only for the many perks that come with membership, but also to join the growing and thriving community that the Society continues to cultivate in the wide-ranging and diverse field of Canadian bioethics. Now, there are a few ways that you can join in today's conversation. We're very pleased to have live simultaneous interpretation available for this session in both English and French. So to hear everything in the language of your preference, please select that language from the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. You'll see that it looks like a little globe. If you can understand both languages, please turn that off, and that way you'll hear everything in the original language as spoken. At the end of both presentations, we'll be holding a live discussion period. At any time during today's event, you can enter a question using the Q&A function, not the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. You may enter your question in either French or English. Your name may appear alongside the question if it's read aloud, but it will not be read in the recording. You may also select the option to ask your question anonymously if you would not like your name to appear to other participants. Another way that you can ask the question to our panelists during the live discussion period is by using the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. If you raise your hand, the moderators will call on you by name at the opportune moment, and you'll be unmuted to be able to ask your question aloud. If you choose to go this route, we ask that you please keep your question brief and to the point so that we can maximize our time together. We would be very grateful for any thoughts and feedback that you have on today's session. And so to share your thoughts, please email us at canadianbioethicssociety@gmail.com. I'm honored to join you all. Also, please note that the session is being recorded, and the full recording will be posted on the CBS website at bioethics.ca after the event. I'm honored and privileged to be joining you all today from Chubuktuk, which is part of Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Ulnu or Mi'kmaq people. The vast territory of Mi'kmaq includes the territory today known as Nova Scotia, PEI, Eastern New Brunswick, the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec, and southern Newfoundland. Chubuktuk means the Great Harbor, and it refers to the water surrounding this place, which has always been a site of exchange and commerce between peoples. This territory is included in the treaties of peace and friendship, which Ulnu, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy people first signed with the British Crown in 1726. These treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Ulnu and Maliseet title to the land and established rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. In recognizing the heritage of the land on which I stand, I would like to express my gratitude to the Ulnu and Maliseet for their historical and ongoing stewardship of these lands, waters, and air. I also invite you to take a moment to reflect upon the place where you find yourself and on the past and present generations of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people that have made it all possible for us to gather here today. The Canadian Bioethics Society is an interdisciplinary and interprofessional community that provides a national forum for all those who are interested in the field of bioethics, especially as we engage with it here in Canada. As our National Bioethics Society, the CBS-SCB is a gathering place for us to constructively engage the wide range of bioethical issues that affect the health and well-being of people here at home and of the environment that we all share. Our members are academics and researchers, healthcare professionals, practicing ethicists and ethics committee members, students, journalists, public policy experts, retirees, writers, and so many others who are committed to ongoing exchange and collaboration across this cross-Canadian network. Some of the upcoming activities organized by and enjoyed by our CBS-SCB members include this conversation series that fosters dialogue and keeps us connected throughout the year outside of our annual conference. This is, unfortunately, the final conversation series of 2023, but planning is well underway for a third conversation series in 2024. So be sure to follow us on social media and to check our website for more updates about upcoming events in the new year. And please do email us if there are particular topics that you'd like to see covered. As many of you know, this week is National Health Ethics Week, so we have another not to miss event that is coming up in just a few days. This Friday, November 10th, from 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, the CBS-SCB is hosting a workshop on writing about bioethics for the mainstream media. If your organization is planning on hosting an event that is open to the public during National Health Ethics Week, please do send us word so we can publicize and share about it on our social media channels. I also want to mention that the 32nd annual CBS-SCB conference is just around the corner. This year, it's being held in partnership with the 18th Annual International Conference on Clinical Ethics and Consultation, and will be taking place in Montreal from May 29th to 31st, 2024. The theme is Partnering with Patients and Communities. Both registration and the call for proposals are both open, so please do visit the CBS-SCB website at www.bioethics.ca to learn more and to sign up. We look forward to seeing you there. The Canadian Bioethics Society is led by a hardworking and dedicated board of directors and by our exceptional administrator, Mary Lou Scott-Smith, and individual members of the Society are joined by a growing cast of supporting organizations from coast to coast who sustain the Society in many ways and allow us to continue to exist as a registered charity and not-for-profit organization. In this conversation series, we wish to demonstrate our gratitude to our many supporting organizations. At each session, we've invited one of our supporting organizations to tell us a little bit about themselves and the work that they do. And today we're very pleased to spotlight Fraser Health Authority, and we're happy that we have with us today Susan Rink, who is the leader of the Ethics and Diversity Services, to say a few words. Over to you, Susan.
Thanks very much, Kath. Good day. My name is Susan Rink, as Catherine indicated, from Fraser Health Ethics Services. Thank you to the CBS-SCB for providing an opportunity to highlight our department. Fraser Health Authority is the largest of the 5 regional health authorities in BC, and we are located just east of Vancouver. We provide services on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish and Inclapamuk nations, and we deliver hospital and community-based services to more than 1.9 million people in 20 diverse communities from Burnaby to Fraser Canyon. We oversee a budget of $4 billion and have close to 50,000 staff, including physician partners and volunteers. Our communities include a diverse multicultural population, including 6 Métis chartered communities and approximately 62,000 Indigenous peoples associated with 32 First Nation communities. 80% of new immigrants and refugees in BC come to Fraser Health. At a high level, next slide, please. At a high level, we provide support to the region in these main areas: system level or organizational ethics consultation, clinical ethics consultation, education and training, moral distress support, and research and ethics. Next slide, please. Our departmental objectives are to support decision-making across the region, strengthen the capacity of individuals and teams to collaboratively make hard decisions in a context of diversity and inequality, and help individuals and the organizations live with greater integrity. Next slide, please. Our system-level service provides support and guidance to leaders in making especially controversial or complex organizational decisions. The service provides facilitation of a process to deal with the issue from question identification to implementation. We help the organization ensure these policy decisions are analyzed through an equal respect, equitable treatment policy lens, are informed by the values of the community groups affected, and are ethically justified and implemented effectively. Aside from a selection of our active consults on the slide shown, members of our team also support national endeavors on decision-making, including the COVID-19 Working Group of the National Advisory Committee on Immunization and the National Strategy for Drugs for Rare Diseases Implementation Advisory Group. Next slide, please. Another service area is our clinical ethics consultation service. We provide on-site and virtual consultation support in difficult and complex cases, accessing interpreters where needed. To date, we have provided support in close to 60 patient care situations where there has been uncertainty or disagreement, either between the care providers or between providers and patients and/or their loved ones. We have an evaluation model for this service, which helps us identify areas of growth and strengthen our service accordingly. Next slide, please. Ethics Services provides a range of education experiences that help participants to achieve learning through our annual bioethics course. In its 17th offering, our accredited 5-month course aims to support leaders to use a systematic, values-based, evidence-informed decision-making method, facilitate discussions with others using this process, and strengthen knowledge, skills, and attributes in ethics in a context of diversity and inequality. Our course has graduated over 400 leaders, and we work to maintain and support the continued education of the network of graduates. Our other educational offerings include virtual and in-person sessions, regularly amount to more than 10,000 person hours of instruction annually. New projects under development for 2024 completion that you may be interested in are our Ethics Fellowship Program and Regional Moral Distress Support Strategy. We're always keen to collaborate, so please reach out. And we're also hiring in a variety of roles. So if you're interested in working with us, please email. Thank you again to the CBS-SCB for inviting us to share our story. And back to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you so much on behalf of the CBS-SCB for all of Fraser Health support and for your many contributions to bioethics in Canada. Now, without further ado, it is my very great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session, Professor Daryl Pullman, who will introduce our speakers and facilitate our discussion. Daryl is a university research professor of bioethics in the Center for Bioethics, Faculty of Medicine at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. He has broad experience in both research and clinical ethics and publishes widely on a range of issues in bioethics, including medical genetics and genomics, ethics and aging, and issues related to privacy and intellectual property. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Daryl. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you to the Canadian Bioethics Society for all their efforts in putting together this excellent event, and I'm glad to be part of it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking ahead of time because we've got two excellent speakers, and we want to have a conversation here. So it's exciting to be part of this day where we're talking about justice and global health ethics. Like many who work in bioethics, I've always had an interest in global health ethics, but for me personally, and I think for many others, it was kind of an interesting academic pursuit that we thought about and occasionally read about and so forth. But the pandemic kind of brought it home to all of us in a very real and personal way, and so many of these issues in global bioethics are very pertinent. Justice issues are especially at the forefront, and we've got two excellent speakers today. So I'm going to introduce each of our speakers. I'm going to introduce both of them, and then each one of them will present, and then we're going to have an opportunity to engage in some conversation with them about their talk. So our first speaker today is Dr. Ryoa Chung. She's a co-director of the Centre de Research on Ethics with Professor Kristen Voigt from McGill and full professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Montreal. Since June 2023, she has been serving as Vice President of the Canadian Philosophy Association. She was a visiting doctoral student at the École Normale Supérieure de Fontenay-Saint-Claude, Paris in 1997 and completed her PhD in philosophy at the University of Montreal in 2001. She was a visiting scholar at Columbia University in 2002 and at the Harvard School of Public Health in 2003. She received an award for teaching excellence in 2005 from the I'm not quite sure where, but she's her fields of research are ethics and international relations and applied political philosophy in the field of global health. And so we're very pleased to have her joining us today. And before she gives her talk, I'm going to introduce our second speaker, who's Dr. Maxwell Smith. Dr. Smith is an assistant professor and Western Research Chair in Public Health Ethics in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Western University. He also serves as an associate director of Western's Rotman Institute of Philosophy and has cross appointments in the Department of Philosophy, Schulich Interfaculty Program in Public Health, and Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. He has served in numerous advisory positions to governments and health authorities, including as a member of Ontario's COVID-19 Vaccine Distribution Task Force, the Public Health Agency of Canada's Public Health Ethics Consultative Group, and the World Health Organization's COVID-19 Ethics Expert Working Group. Professor Smith's research is primarily in the area of public health ethics, with a focus on infectious disease ethics and the ethical demands that health equity and social justice place on governments and institutions to protect and promote the public's health. So looking forward to both of our speakers, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chung. I believe she's going to be making her presentation in French, so please avail yourself of the translation services that were described earlier. So thank you, Dr. Chung.
Merci infiniment pour l'invitation. Thank you so much for the invitation. It is
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Sharing this conversation with Maxwell and with Daryl and with all the team de la Société canadienne de bioéthique. Alors, merci encore une fois et merci.
So thank you again, and thank you to the interpreters who will translate my presentation into English. The PowerPoint is in English in order to make understanding easier, but I will be speaking in French. First of all, the title of my presentation, that will be about 10 minutes long. And please let me know if I go over, or please let me know about 5 minutes before the end. So the title of the presentation is Human Right to Health, Human Security versus the phenomenon of the securitization of health. These are works that were funded by the Research Council of Canada, and part of my presentation is from a chapter that will be published in a book that will be published at Oxford University Press, edited by Jude Brown and Maeve McEwen, and which is titled "What is Structural Injustice?" It will be eventually open source in the spring, and my chapter is titled COVID-19 and Global Structural Health Inequality. So part of my presentation is from this article, this paper, and I'm trying to find a way of changing the slide. And another part I have to emphasize is from the chapter that has just been published in a book that is now in bookstores. It's been so for a few days. Justice in Global Health, New Perspectives and Current Issues, co-edited by Imani Bakuni and Lucas Miozzo, one of our young colleagues of the new generation who work on ethics in global health. And I had the privilege of working with Joanne Liu, who is the former international president of Médecins Sans Frontières. And we were able to write this paper titled The Ethical Issues and the Securitization of Health. And I would like to thank her for that. I will present 3 ideas in my presentation. First of all, very briefly, the first idea will be about what human right to health is. The second part will be about a notion that emerged around the 1990s about human security, which includes security in health, and how we need to distinguish this discourse about human security, and this will be my third idea, from a current phenomenon, which I think is a tragic phenomenon, which we call securitization of health in the name of national interests. And so I will present those 3 ideas.
The human right to health. Et je vais donc
the first idea, human right to health. And I would like to quote Article 25 of the new UN Declaration of Human Rights. I'll read it in English.
Of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Et donc, c'était la première occurrence d'un droit.
So this was the first occurrence of a human right to health, which is the basis of international cooperation and solidarity in terms of health in the world. There are 2 types of justification for such international cooperation in health. First of all, there are prudential arguments, that is, purely instrumental arguments that serve the interests of everyone. And the idea is to say that international cooperation is one for all and all for one, like the 3 Musketeers. And there is, I would say, a reflected selfishness for each state, because our world is divided into states, and those are the fundamental actors, but they're not the only ones. But the first actors to which the principles of international cooperation are addressed are states. And the second justification for international cooperation are arguments that are philosophical and ethical. They are based on the moral justification and universalism of a right to health, despite any cultural or ideological differences. One way of defending this approach, which might not be perfect or ideal, but which for the time being is the only one that has some kind of political lever, is the human rights approach. So we can define moral universalism even if we take into account cultural relativism that we have in this world today. And we can argue that fundamental human rights, including the human right to health, is a basic right, a right that enables people to exert their other rights, political and civic rights. This is the approach that has been expressed by Henry Shue, and there's also Amartya Sen that has defended the approach of capabilities and have used the universalism and the moral basis for this capabilities approach. there might be cultural differences, but the concept of human capabilities is based on those things that we should be and we should be able to do despite our differences. Norman Daniels, another philosopher, mentioned what was specific in terms of health, and being healthy and healthy enough is the basic condition that enables the exercise of other rights and human conditions. And this is why we want to defend a human right to health. Now, my second idea of human security is a concept that emerged in the 1990s, actually in 1994, to be precise. That was in a report that was produced by the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. So in this report, this 1994 report, there was the idea of human security that was there to remind that security issues were not only the concern of states, but also of individuals and populations in the world and through borders as well. So there was, again, a form of moral universalism to the idea of human security. And in the work about human security in the 90s, there were 7 components: health security, economic security, food security, environmental security, personal security, community security, and political security. And so the idea was to say that international cooperation was based on human security, including health security. And that has to be distinguished from a phenomenon that we have today, which is securitization of health. It is important to distinguish the two, I think, because this notion of securitization of health sometimes is in violent conflict with international cooperation in global health. So a very quick definition of this is from 9/11. The vocabulary of securitization of health appeared, and securitization of health refers to the phenomenon through which we understand health issues as elevated to national interests and national security. And one of the more troubling consequences of secularization of health is to subordinate human rights, and that saying that they're less important to national interests and national security. And states invoke their right to national security, and that can actually come into conflict with global human rights. And a phenomenon, and I will mention just one of 3 scenarios, is health nationalism that we saw in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a predatory race to vaccines in order to counter SARS-CoV-2 during the pandemic. And South Africa and India had sent a request that was supported by about 100 countries, a request to the World Trade Organization to suspend pharmaceutical patents in order to distribute vaccines in the whole world and facilitate distribution of vaccines worldwide. And despite the discourse of vaccine equity that was defended by the World Health Organization, the wealthiest countries in this world, including Canada, the European Union, Japan, and so on, decided to oppose those countries' requests those countries who were asking for the suspension of pharmaceuticals patents. I won't go into details, but we saw how this predatory race to vaccine happened in practice in the world during the pandemic. And we saw how the concept of international solidarity and vaccine equity was a failure when we analyzed this phenomenon as a case study to measure the capacity of cooperation, international cooperation in terms of global health in a context of a health crisis. So this is the first example that I wanted to mention, and I'll stop here. We can perhaps mention other examples of securitization of health later, but I hope that this presentation was clear enough for everyone, whether you were listening in English or in French. And thank you again to the interpreters who still have the very difficult task of doing the simultaneous interpretation, but I hope that this was clear enough for everyone, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chung, for interesting sort of setting the stage for more discussion and conversation, I expect, as we proceed forward. I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Maxwell Smith for his presentation. And then, again, I would encourage people to be thinking about questions and be using the various functions available, including the Q&A, so that when we open it up for conversation, we'll have things to talk about. Dr. Smith.
Thanks very much, Daryl, for the introduction and for moderating the session. And thanks to Catherine and the rest of the CBS team for inviting me and hosting me as part of this conversation. And a big thanks to Ryo for providing a nice philosophical foundation for some of the issues that I want to raise in my conversation here. So this is a big topic. Some great work has gone into thinking about global health justice, of course, by philosophers and human rights scholars, helping to think through the different philosophical reasons and justifications for how we think about justice in the global health sphere, including some of the structural issues that we need to attend to and address. Also, at the same time, some great work has gone into some of the policies or actions that need to be introduced in order to advance global health justice in some way. And of course, those policies or actions aren't always mirrored or seen in practice. But the admittedly meager contribution that I want to make in my presentation is really just to draw on my experience working with policymakers during the pandemic over the past 3+ years to illuminate what I see as common practical barriers to achieving or advancing equity, even among those who sit around those policy-making tables and confess a commitment to equity. Things over the past 4 years that have really made me think, that's not helping very much. We really should try to change that if we are actually committed to global health justice and equity. And to digest that within the 10 or 15 minutes that I have, what I've tried to do is distill some of these deficits into 5 distinct failures, in my view, of how we think about and pursue equity in practice. 5 deficits that lead me to believe what we're really committed to, if we're committed to equity at all, is really something that we might call equity light, because it's missing some pretty important features if we actually think about some of those philosophical foundations that Ryoa had presented around what we think global health justice commits us to. So just before I get started, I wanted to disclose some of my relationships here, but also really just to set the context, because I said what I want to be doing is providing some insights from my practical experience working with policymakers. This gives you a sense of perhaps who those might be. That includes working with the World Health Organization's Ethics and COVID Expert Working Group, as well as its ACT Accelerator Ethics and Governance Working Group during COVID, as well as my continued work with the Public Health Agency of Canada's Public Health Ethics Consultative Group and Ontario's COVID-19 Vaccine Distribution Task Force, which Daryl mentioned in my bio. So to get started then, one of the deficits that I experienced over the past 3+ years when policymakers have talked about equity at some of these policymaking tables is that ethics was often absent from those conversations. So one example that I want to draw everyone's attention to is the World Health Organization's concept for fair access and equitable allocation of COVID-19 health products. This was a document that was developed by members of the World Health Organization to help set a framework for how the ACT Accelerator and COVAX would distribute diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines in a way that was considered equitable and fair. And this was one example, but not the only example, where I heard folks who were involved in this process and very keen on the allocation of these products to be fair and equitable, to say that equity is in fact a technical term, not an ethical value that admits of many different ethical interpretations and normative commitments. And so there was a real uphill battle, I think, even from the start, among those who said they cared about equity, to even acknowledge and identify that equity is in fact an ethical value, and there is a lot that we might think about and navigate in terms of what the ethical commitments are for equity and fairness in the distribution of these products. Distinctions that we might draw, even drawing upon Ryoa's work, between global health justice and charity or security. There's many different ways we might interpret these, which has implications for how we allocate these products. Now, one of the things that was mentioned in this concept was a commitment that all countries, regardless of their developmental or economic status, should have access to a share of these products, the diagnostics, therapies, and vaccines, once they're available. This was cashed out in terms of an initial tranche of doses that would be made available, this is vaccines in particular, to countries until they can cover 3% of their population, and thereafter a more gradual supply of vaccine to expand this to 20% of the national population in every country. So of course, there's a lot of different ways we might think about what equity or fairness requires in the global allocation of vaccines. There was much debate really around the distinction between focusing on vulnerability to COVID and perhaps the burden of disease that is experienced in some countries, sometimes contrasted with the vulnerability given structural deficiencies in some countries, perhaps health systems that aren't very strong, and perhaps those as providing some reason to allocate vaccines in different ways. And yet the approach taken was really egalitarian to say, look, we're going to make sure that every country gets vaccines such that they can cover 3% of their population. So whether this really reflects a core commitment to what equity requires at WHO and among member states is sort of an unknown question for me, but it really reflects, I think, just one view about what this might require, and not as many in the ethics sphere, I think, have argued for such an interpretation of what equity would require for global vaccine equity. So that's just one example about how equity was really discussed and thought about in this space with not much regard for ethics and how we might think about what those ethical commitments might look like. The second deficiency or deficit is how equity was discussed, and we tried to pursue equity without much accountability. So this is just an example from August of 2021, where the World Health Organization called for a moratorium on booster doses of the vaccine until at least the end of September, in order to enable at least 10% of the population of every country to be vaccinated. This is where we were seeing, Canadians and those in the global north receiving third and sometimes even fourth doses before first doses were being administered in low and middle income countries. An updated speech in September extended this moratorium until at least the end of the year, because we really weren't seeing any more access and distribution of these vaccines to countries in the global south. So this was laudable by the World Health Organization to call on this moratorium. But the point about accountability that I want to raise here is about who is responsible for actually heeding that call. This is an example of a document, some guidance by Canada's National Advisory Committee on Immunization, or NACI, whose responsibilities are to make guidance to the provinces and territories about how they ought to distribute their vaccines. And I think laudably here as well, NACI acknowledged even within that guidance, even though their remit isn't about global vaccine equity, it's about how we achieve the distribution and equity in distribution within the country. They acknowledge the importance of global vaccine equity, and they acknowledge that the World Health Organization has called on individual countries to make vaccine booster dose policy decisions that balance the public health benefits to their population with support for global equity and vaccine access. And yet, how we distributed vaccines in this country didn't really jive with those, with that support for vaccine booster dose policy and vaccine distribution elsewhere in the world. So it wasn't NACI's mandate, of course, to think about how to allocate vaccines elsewhere. Their mandate is domestic. And similarly, as mentioned, I was on Ontario's vaccine distribution task force. The sorts of decisions that we make or advice that we give has implications, of course, for what happens with our share of vaccines in this country and how much vaccine we might be bringing in. But again, the accountability for vaccine distribution at that table was strictly domestic, it was strictly provincial in the province of Ontario. And so everywhere I looked, at every table that I sat at, it seemed as if everyone had responsibility domestically or inward, but not outward to other countries. And so the question of global vaccine equity and who's accountable for it seemed to slip through everyone's fingers. The third deficit or deficiency I wanted to point to was this commitment to equity without really thinking globally, really about solidarity or global solidarity. This isn't, you're not meant to read this, but this is just an example of a document that Anna Komparek and I produced in December of 2020 to try to synthesize some of the frameworks that were being developed in different jurisdictions for how to allocate vaccines domestically. And what we found was that every country on the planet thus far who had developed such a framework had used a risk-based approach. They identified that those at higher risk from COVID ought to be prioritized for vaccination before those at lower risk. So this seemed that there was some ethical consensus about who ought to be prioritized and that risk ought to be one of the prevailing criteria that we ought to use to inform prioritization. And yet we did not apply that same rubric or ethical schema globally, because we did not look at which countries or which populations are at greatest risk globally and prioritize those. We only did those within countries and within our internal frameworks. So really a focus on equity domestically and internally, but we just ignored those same principles and ideas globally or to other countries and citizens. The fourth deficit that I wanted to mention was we wanted to pursue equity, but we didn't really want to encounter any difficulty in doing so. So this might take you back a bit. You might recall in 2021, vaccine trackers were all the rage. You couldn't turn on the news without seeing a ticker along the bottom to know how many vaccines we had administered. And the great thing about these trackers was that they really did show the disparities between vaccine uptake and rollout in Canada or the global north versus other countries. And yet what they ended up doing, I found, happened to have the opposite effect of drawing attention to those disparities and rectifying them. And that is because vaccine trackers really did one thing. They measured one thing, and that is speed. So you can see here in the upper left, we measured how many vaccine doses had been administered, how many administered per 100 people or administered per day, or how many have been administered out of the number of vaccines that have been distributed to the country. And instead of really showing us the disparities between countries here, what ended up happening was an immense pressure on governments, so pressure on the Canadian government, for instance, to do better, to speed up, that we are in fact slower than the United States or Israel, and isn't that a problem? And so what we ended up having were these fights about fairness on the one hand and speed that are privileging or at least having some attention to fairness or equity was getting in the way of speed and rolling out vaccines as quickly as possible. And so can't we do away with the equity bit and just go as fast as possible? And in fact, in many cases, we did sacrifice equity for speed. This was a case in Ontario as well. So really, really trying to get vaccines to those hard to reach populations or perhaps populations who are more difficult to reach and then to ensure that they get vaccinated. That's not the fastest way to get vaccines in arms. And so if we want to look good in those vaccine trackers and be accountable to our constituents who are pushing us to maybe do that as quickly as possible. Finally, this last point about how we did want to make sacrifices. So I tried to anonymize these as best I can, but there's a particular of Twitter offered a booster dose in Canada that they're grateful, but they would decline until Canada fulfills its pledges to COVAX in order to promote global vaccine equity. Millions of health professionals and at-risk populations globally are still waiting for their first dose, and that's wrong. This seems like a laudable view, trying to balance the protective effects of vaccination for ourselves in Canada with trying to protect others in other parts of the world. And yet this was met, at least in my perspective, on social media, which isn't maybe the best example of some antagonism. So this individual said, I support vaccine equity, but I'm vulnerable and will get a third dose as soon as it's available. We also saw points that the narrative that was presented in this first post is egocentric and uncompassionate with no regard for the well-being of our vulnerable Canadians. We should give all of our vaccines to COVAX, and it's okay to let our seniors and most vulnerable die. So clearly, if we want to promote global vaccine equity, we may need to be a little bit slower here in Canada in rolling out our vaccines or make other concessions, but this seemed untenable to many, and that's perhaps why we didn't see the political reflection of that particular approach. And that's why I think really we've been operating under this idea of equity light. Equity has been at the center of our discourse when we talk about vaccine allocation during this pandemic, and yet we have failed in many respects to actually achieve global health equity in that regard. Thanks very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Max, and thank you again to Ryoa for your excellent overviews, and you've certainly given us things to think about. We do have a few questions coming up here, and again, there of course seems to be a difference of opinion about exactly the how we understand and apply these different concepts. So I'm just going to ask these questions, and it's not the two that I've got so far aren't directed to anyone in particular. So I'll perhaps ask each one of you to respond. But so this is the first one, and it just says, what if the vaccines neither fit our common language definition nor come proven as safe and health promoting? How does Health Canada or WHO justify their participation in the name of equity in a bait and switch predatory marketing of products that at any other time in medical history would have been pulled out of the market immediately because the shots are seriously harming and killing suddenly 1 out of 500 takers among young people? So that's the it's a comment as much as a question, and again, I'm not an expert on vaccines, and I'm not sure of the details here, but Max, I'll ask you first if you've got a response, and then I'll pass it to Dr. Chung as well.
Yeah, happy to speak to that, at least as much as I can, Daryl. I mean, this is a talk about global health justice. We're not vaccinologists or regulatory authorities here, so I don't think that's for us to say. But I will say that every national regulatory authority in the world have approved these vaccines and have demonstrated that they are sufficiently safe and effective for authorization. And our job is to then think through how they might be distributed in an equitable way in order to protect the health of those who are most at risk. If there are questions about the safety of the vaccines, then those questions can be asked of those with expertise in that.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Chung?
Oui, alors si j'ai bien compris,
so if I understand correctly, I'm going to keep speaking French, and it's going to be translated, but you tell me if I need to speak English to make the conversation easier. So I'm going to follow up on what Maxwell said. I don't believe that our conversation today is about the safety of vaccines or vaccine hesitancy or anything of the sort. Well, the example was talking about equitable distribution of vaccines, but it was only one example among our collective memory to illustrate the failures in terms of cooperation or international solidarity in global health. So as Maxwell, I'm going to consider that vaccines were safe enough to be distributed internationally. During an interview on the radio, somebody asked, but you know, vaccine hesitancy, what does it make sense to distribute vaccines internationally if populations are hesitant and will not get the vaccination? Now, this phenomenon of vaccine hesitancy is very complex, and it's very interesting to study, and it is much more complicated than one could think. For instance, populations showed maximum hesitancy because they had, because of their history with medical authorities, they had the feeling that they had been used in a way or another. Racial discrimination in the US, for instance, could explain why some types of population did not trust health authorities. So it's more a question of trust towards health authorities and their representatives. But it is a different question. It is a separate question. This is not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is that there was a lack of solidarity and cooperation. And this is what we're trying to talk about today. And I would like to come back to that concept of equity that was well presented by Maxwell. I'm going to, so inequity or equity in health was developed by Margaret Whitehead within WHO a few decades ago, but it's still the definition that we work with.
Disparities in health that are a result of systematic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices that create barriers to opportunity. Alors que ce soit les vaccins ou que ce soit, par exemple,
so whether we're talking about vaccines or generic medication against HIV/AIDS at the beginning of the year 2000 in sub-Saharan Africa, well, there has been debates to prohibit pharmaceutical patents and intellectual property rights, to suspend intellectual property rights. Well, it is the same example. There are forms of inequities that are also translated into solidarity and cooperation problems in terms of global health, whether we're talking about vaccine or generic medication in different types of pandemics. I think that the bottom line is that we lacked ethical approach to get ethical distribution globally.
Thank you, Dr. Chung. Another question here. If 3% of the vaccines would go to developing countries, was there any oversight about the distribution? Did it go to those at the highest risk or to the wealthy and connected in the developing world? Do we have any information about that, either Dr. Chung or Dr. Smith?
Yeah, Daryl. So the initial plan from the ACT Accelerator and COVAX was to distribute vaccines to countries such that every country, not just low and middle income countries, but every country could vaccinate 3% of their population. then expand that to 20%, and then there may be different sorts of agreements to continue to expand and vaccinate the rest of their populations. Who exactly those vaccines went to once they went to those countries was a question for those countries to answer, because the World Health Organization has no authority to tell what countries what they can do with their vaccines and who they ought to prioritize. There was guidance, of course, that was produced to say these are the populations who tend to be at greater risk or who may benefit more from vaccination. And it was up to countries to then form their own groups and look at that evidence and make their own decisions for themselves. Largely, though, most countries tended to prioritize the same sorts of groups. And they were those who were older, those who had comorbid conditions, and who would be at greater risk from COVID, at least first, and then expanding after that to other populations. But no, from COVAX's perspective, there was no discussion about how individual countries should prioritize or distribute their vaccines. There was no authority for them to do so.
Right. And I mean, that seems pretty common across the board with various with the United Nations in general, for example. There's these are kind of aspirational things that we have in mind. We really don't have the mechanisms to enforce those things. And unfortunately, if there's a corrupt regime, suddenly because of a pandemic, we can't expect that suddenly equity will be observed. So another question, or Dr. Chung, did you have a response there?
Alors, peut-être simplement dire
Yes,
que
maybe just saying that the whole COVAX accelerator treatment was a very interesting phenomenon to analyze, because obviously we were in a completely unheard of context, unprecedented situation, and we really managed to come up with a mechanism that was supposed to increase international cooperation. And I will say very clearly that I think that the leadership of Dr. Ted Ross at the head of WHO really proved his ethical conviction, but it didn't necessarily translate into action. And one of the problems with COVAX is that, well, there are very interesting aspects of global health governance with WHO, because now we have a constellation of actors, governmental or private actors, like the Bill Gates Foundation, which was quite significantly involved in the conversation. Some NGOs too, who have portfolios that are sometimes bigger than the budget of some countries. So we've had a whole range of actors with inequalities in their relations between those actors, which makes the analysis of this phenomenon very interesting. There was the negotiation between regarding the suspension of intellectual rights, and the WHO, which is not a UN agency, does not have any organic relation with the UN, was able to undermine the moral and ethical leadership. The UN undermined the leadership of WHO. And this is where you can see the problems of those cooperation mechanisms at the international scale. Those are challenges that have to be addressed. And at the end of the day, we had to rely on a form of capitalist philanthropy, because we resorted to charity rather than ethical equity concepts or distributive justice to make sure that COVAX would work. And we had to rely on the discretionary will of governments without any enforcement mechanism or any sanctions applied to apply a robust international mechanisms. So capitalist philanthropy, even if it's well-intentioned, will not always be the solution to future pandemics, sanitary crises, or climate change crisis that are going to be in our future.
Great, thank you. This is a question for Dr. Smith. Given there's such a well-developed discourse around justice and equity in global health, this talk is just one example. Why do you think a vague notion of equity was so popular during the COVID pandemic, but there were so many challenges translating actual ethics into practice? Do you think there is a disconnect between bioethics, public health ethicists, and public health policymakers in that respect?
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. That's a fantastic question. I have two responses. They might be cynical, unfortunately. The first is often some of the really important philosophical work. So Ryoa mentioned her work with Joanne, some of the work of Norman Daniels and Amartya Sen and others. That work is really important to build on to inform policy. Unfortunately, policymakers don't tend to read a lot of the work that either philosophers produce or public health ethicists or bioethicists produce. We've done a fantastic job clinically, I think, in clinical ethics to embed clinical ethics ethicists in hospitals, learn how to navigate patient and other decision-making clinically, to understand the constraints within the system we're working with and how to think about those in an ethical way. We haven't done the same thing with policy, I'm afraid. So we sort of expect some of the good philosophical work that we've produced to simply inform policy-making decisions. What we need is a bit of a buffer to say, what does the application of those views look like in practice? And then what do we do when they come up against other constraints, resource or otherwise, that doesn't permit us to fully enact what those commitments mean? And if we don't have answers for that, I think policymakers just shrug and move on or do whatever they were going to do in the first instance. So that's one particular view that I have. The other view, which is the even more cynical view, I think, is by leaving ideas like equity or fairness or justice vague, you can get away with whatever you want. You can go ahead and just do what you're going to do in the first place under the rubric of equity or solidarity. It's very easy to commit oneself to solidarity or equity and just ignore the fact that we disagree bitterly about what that actually means in practice, but then we can continue to use the words, whether it's ethicists, whether it's public health authorities, or whether it's politicians. So I think our job as bioethicists is to hold those who use this moral language to account, to say, well, what precisely does that mean? These words, these values that are ostensibly guiding everything that we're doing, they're policy mandates. They're saying these are the things that we are enacting with our policies, and so they better be specific enough and really outline what those commitments mean in ethical terms if we want them to achieve those goals. So I think that's our job. So it's not all cynical. I think those are the reasons that I sort of foresee, but I think we have a role to maybe correct that and rectify it in some way. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Chung, you have a further word on that?
Perhaps one thing that I've seen since COVID-19 is that even within the academic community and the bioethics community, I think that there has been more sharing between disciplines. I'm more of a political philosopher than a bioethicist. If you talk about disciplines, and I'm not saying that in bioethics there's no mention of justice. Of course there are, but they're perhaps more from an individual point of view, the relationship between practitioner and the patient, and which is different from what Maxwell does in terms of public policy and what I do in terms of what does fairness means? What does equity mean in terms in more philosophical terms? And I think that since COVID-19, there's been a more of an overture, so that we could have more of a collective conversation and less separated according to disciplines. It's more multidisciplinary now. And this is a good thing, and I hope that we'll be able to engage conversations at the level of public policies as well. And I gotta come back to one of the questions that I've seen. Question from Manisha Pawa, I think. Yes.
Yes.
And this.
Yes, I thank you for that that comment, Dr. Chung. I appreciate your perspective on justice as being from a political, social political philosophy perspective. I'm teaching a course in ethics theory right now, and we're actually using Beecham and Childress's book as kind of a foil to sort of think through some of the things. And I've suggested there that they should put the chapter on justice before they do the other chapters on autonomy and so forth, because the way that we conceive of the just society, or the just world for that matter, will impact our understanding of those other principles as well. So I appreciate that. So we do have another question here. Aside from vaccines, what other approaches were considered or should have been considered in order to advance global health equity during the pandemic? And the question says, I'm concerned that the emphasis on vaccines might reflect social biases toward biotech solutions at the expense of social and political determinants of COVID-19 incidence and mortality.
If I may, justement, je voulais rebondir sur la question de Manisha Pawa pour illustrer.
Yes, indeed. Actually, I wanted to come back to this question to say about something that could give us more hope. The whole paradigm and the theoretical framework of social determinants of health. And I think that has actually had an impact on public health policies in different countries, in Canada, in Great Britain as well. It wasn't perfect, but we've seen that there was a theoretical and practical view of social determinants of health that were taken into account and were very much mobilized in Latin America and in Central America in particular as well. And political philosophers like Amartya Sen have really tried to give a philosophical justification of the use of the social determinant of health model. And I think that this question brings us to the idea of reopening this conversation, even though we're still in a pandemic, but we now have to discuss how to prevent future health crises and come back to this model of social determinant of health and understand why inequalities have an impact on everyone's health. And we want to better prevent future crises by investing in biotech solutions, yes, but not only that, but also investing on social determinants of health.
Yes, thank you. Any comment there, Max, or did you want to move on to the next?
I can jump in briefly, Daryl. I think everything Ryoa said is, yeah, I completely agree with. I think there's a couple issues. I completely agree that we focus so much on vaccines and equity there that we probably miss a lot of what we need to be thinking about in terms of equity. Where bioethicists tend to get brought into these conversations is in the setting priorities and allocating of resources, right? So you already have the state of affairs in front of you, and your job is just to think within those constraints, how do we achieve the most equity as possible? And I think the first thing that we all realize is that the reason we see these inequities in the first place, and the reason why they're going to be exacerbated by what we're seeing, is because of inequities in the social conditions that determine our health, both domestically and internationally. And so the first question or first thing to remedy is to think about strengthening health systems in other parts of the world, thinking about One Health approaches, thinking about how we can share data more equitably. And yet those are all put on the back burner because we're in the crisis and we need to think about how to equitably distribute the vaccines at this point. And then once you're out of the emergency, there's less appetite to go back and fix some of those structural conditions that cause the inequities in the first place. There isn't as much urgency. And so when I think Ryoa is completely right, when we're thinking about the future and preparing for the prevention and response to future public health emergencies, we should be thinking less about how are we going to navigate these issues, even though this is going to be very important, like allocating resources. It's how do we strengthen health systems? How do we strengthen surveillance and data sharing in advance of those emergencies such that when they happen, we don't see the massive inequities created as we saw during COVID. There's just less appetite, I think, to care about those in general, and then perhaps in the ethics community because they're wicked problems and they're not as sexy as the priority setting issues that we often get involved with.
Great, thank you. Another comment and question says, what I understand you to collectively be arguing is that in order to live up to the demands of health equity and justice, we need both a clear understanding of what this commitment is to, what drives our commitment, and then to be willing to step up and do what is needed to walk this talk. One challenge is that the civic space for deliberating about these ideas are eroding, and the global social and political context seems less and less open to nuanced thinking and deep listening. What might be the role of people who work in bioethics fields and the organizations we work in to move us towards shared understanding and action? And more specifically, what role could the CBS play in this regard? So I'll let you take a crack at that. Solve that one for us, Max, and then we'll let Roy.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. It's a fantastic question because this will all be for naught if we can't engage the public and get them involved in the conversation and have their values reflected in the policies themselves. There's a couple things. So clearly, I think there's appetite to have these conversations, even though the environment is eroding to have productive conversations. That's a challenge. I think people want to have them. I think people have views and want to engage. So I think the role of bioethicists and the society could be to think about how to engage like we are today, maybe broader members of the public to have their voice heard and be part of those conversations. So that's one possible way to do it. I think the role of bioethicists, and maybe the public might have this view, is that we claim to have some moral expertise and the moral answer. So this is what justice demands. And that's the only way that we should think about justice. We can make those views and argue for them, but in policy circles, that's not going to cut it, right? Because we live in plural, liberal democracies in many cases, and our views can't be thrust upon the public or policymakers about how we ought to distribute goods, but these are how we might inform how to do that. So part of the role that we might play is to educate the public about the many different ways we might be able to do this, the different ways that justice might cash out from different perspectives, but also, and perhaps more importantly, illustrate some of the implications of what adopting a particular view might have, right? So this is maybe to Ryoa's point around justice and security and self-interest. There are ways that we might take a self-interested or national security approach to health issues, and we might be able to show how that might be worse for human health long-term or for collective health globally long-term. That could be our job, right? It's not wrong to have that view, but it's to show these are the implications. This is how we might think about the ethics of that. That might change views in the long run. So that's just a small role that we might be able to play.
Dr. Chung?
En ce qui me concerne, c'est vraiment une question.
As far as I'm concerned, it is a very important and fascinating question. And we are living through very difficult times, very troubling times. And indeed, the democratic conversation, public deliberation is endangered because of, well, fake news, false information and the different positions based on ideologies, conflicting ideologies. Now, the role of researchers is to make sure that science is as easily accessible as possible, while trying not to further polarize the different positions. This is what we had with vaccine hesitancy, which I think is fascinating to study because it shows what are the challenges when we talk about those issues in a public setting, public conversation. So I believe that we need to show more flexibility in the way we listen and explain our positions. And this is what I tell my scientists colleagues. We need to find ways to communicate without creating polarization, and we need to find ways to explain to the public while also expressing our convictions. And I also wanted to say that I believe that prudential arguments sometimes need to be used to make the conversation about ethics more accessible. You know that in philosophy, there is a whole tradition based on the notion of prudence, which is the gate to morality. So it's not always a bad idea to have prudential arguments, to use them. For instance, I was talking about nationalism in health. Now, of course, if you take a certain point of view, of course, each government is responsible for its own population, and it's perfectly normal for them to take care of their population. So, for instance, Emmanuel's position in the United States was based on vaccine nationalism. And we don't necessarily need to be shocked by this type of position because it makes sense from a logistics point of view. But what we can say is that inequality is bad for health.
Future pandemics, je pense que c'est une façon tout à fait légitime.
And I think that it is perfectly legitimate way to make ethical arguments accessible to the public. But at the end of the day, what we need to remember constantly is that the human right to health is unconditional.
On prudential grounds exclusively, because sometimes it will be the case that the right to human health and the right to health for some populations will not serve the best interest of all. It should nonetheless be an unconditional right that the community, the international community, would be ready to, would be ready to uphold and to protect for each and all of us. Alors donc c'est ça. Donc quand il y a des limites au discours.
So there are limits to prudential approach, and it is important to remember that at the end of the day, ethical arguments must prevail when we no longer have instrumental arguments to put forward.
That's a nice segue into another question that's been asked, and it's about your views on the idea of equity as distinct from ethics. Do either of you have insights on how people see these as distinct? Like if equity is not about ethics, what are the theoretical foundations of the idea of equity? I know, Max, that was one of your first bullet, I think, is we talk about equity without ethics. Is it just a buzzword? Is it or is there some kind of idea there that is supposed to get some traction for us when we use that term? And if it gets traction not from ethics, where is it getting its traction?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer. My knee-jerk reaction is economics, but I could be completely wrong about that. Of course, equity is a very dominant idea in economics as well. And so there will be particular views from health economists, for instance, about what equity demands in that space. Perhaps that's the dominant view of those making policy. Not to say that that isn't ethics, it's just a different way and disciplinary approach to thinking about it. For those that are using equity and saying they care about equity and not acknowledging or understanding that there are ethical underpinnings and that this is an ethical value, I don't think that is coherent. So I don't think there is a way to use equity in a way that's not ethical. I think what it really is demonstrating is that the ethics and the values that underpin what they mean by equitable are simply tacit, right? And we don't know what that could mean. So it could mean some utilitarian view, it could mean something completely different. And it's not that we need to get all on the same page and agree on what equity means, it's that we need to be explicit about what we think it ought to mean and navigate disagreement in that matter, because perhaps there are things we could agree upon, and maybe that could advance those policy aims a little bit further. I think, part of there's an aversion to doing that because people don't like to have those conversations and disagree. So it's much easier just to use the terms and just ignore the disagreements that happen in the background, and then everyone of every political stripe or any stripe whatsoever can all say they're committed to the same thing and then go about their business.
Right. Any comment, Dr. Chung?
Oui, alors oui, je pense que Maxwell a tout à fait
Yes,
raison.
I believe that Maxwell is right. Part of the analysis, I think, is based on the fact that we have made equity a logistical concept or an economical concept. We need to remind John Rawls, who's a very well-known philosopher. John Rawls reflected upon the concept of distributive justice, something that we use a lot when we talk about public health system here in Canada. And he used economical arguments like the Pareto optimum to explain why it was rational to be equitable. This is what I was saying earlier. Sometimes we forget ethical arguments and we focus on instrumental arguments, but empty, devoid of sense, of meaning, really. I believe that collective education and a certain kind of literacy, scientific, philosophical, ethical literacy, will help remind us that we are not only looking for efficiency here in Canada through our public health system. We have philosophical principles that are based on equity and fairness that explain why we share our collective resources for the most vulnerable, and which explain the social solidarity that we are striving for. And it makes me hopeful in a way every time the public health system is being challenged or questioned. I think that it's very important to get back to the history of it and to the philosophical conversation that is at the basis of it. But it makes me hopeful to see that we are still a country where, that has a public health system and with people who support this system. And it shows that we have a philosophical tradition, that we have a set of values, collective values. Romano, for instance, when he released his report, Guided by Your Values, to support the public health system, among the values that guide us as Canadians was social justice, wealth distribution, social solidarity, fairness, equity. So it is a good thing to think about this common history from time to time. Another example. Back in the times of Cyril Harper, the budget was cut. The budget that was supposed to fund health care to refugees was cut. There was a whole an appeal from doctors to provide proper healthcare to refugees, and Trudeau's government tripled the budget allocated to healthcare for refugees. So this was a positive change, and it is based on common values like solidarity, social solidarity, equity, and so on. The case of migrants and refugees is a test case, and in my opinion, it is one of the three elements of the securitization of health on which I'm working. It is going to be something, well, it's going to be very important in future when we're going to have to welcome migrants for economic, climate reasons or climate change reasons. We need to remember that it is a form of health nationalism to close our borders because of the health of those migrants. It's a form of discrimination. This person is disabled, it's going to be too expensive for our health system, so we're not going to give this person citizenship. This is a form of securitization of health in the name of national interests that is, clashes with the human right to health. So in terms of public policies, we always need to, I think that we need to support a lottery, and we shouldn't select migrants on the basis of what their health is. It is a mistake, I think, but this is a conversation that maybe we can have some other time.
Right. Well, thank you very much. And your last comment there, Dr. Chung, you mentioned not just equity but solidarity and a number of these other important ethical values that we have to treat them. We have to take them as a group. We can't sort of talk about equity without talking about solidarity and these other kinds of considerations. So we're pretty well out of time. I'd like to thank both of our presenters and all of those who participated in the conversation. Thank you very much. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Catherine to make a few final comments. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daryl. And thank you so much, Ryoa and Maxwell, for sharing your thoughts and for your insights today on this important topic. I also want to thank our behind-the-scenes team, Catherine, Victoria, Amanda, Andrew, and our translators for their diligent work in realizing this Canadian Bioethics Society Conversation Series event. And thank you, too, to our audience for your questions and for your engagement on today's topic. We're happy to have you here. This concludes today's conversation on justice in global health ethics and our final Conversation Series event of the year. We hope to see you all again very soon, either at this Friday's workshop on writing on bioethics for the media, and hopefully at future Conversation Series events in the new year. So happy National Health Ethics Week, everybody, and thank you again so much for being here. Have a great day, everyone.